The sharp crack of plastic hitting concrete echoed through the main hallway of Riverside High as Derek Chun's scientific calculator shattered into a dozen pieces, its LCD screen flickering once before going black forever. Emma Rodriguez stood frozen, watching 3 years of careful savings money earned from tutoring younger kids and helping her single mother clean office buildings on weekends scattered across the polished floor like electronic confetti. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The laughter that followed was even more devastating than the destruction itself, amplified by the smartphones already recording what would become the most shared video in the school's history, though not for the reasons anyone expected. Emma Rodriguez had always believed that excellence was her armor. For 17 years, she had lived by the simple philosophy that if she studied hard enough, achieved enough, and stayed invisible enough, the world would leave her alone to pursue the one thing that made sense in her chaotic life: mathematics. Numbers didn't lie, equations didn't judge, and formulas didn't care that her shoes came from the thrift store or that her lunch money sometimes went toward her mother's prescription medications instead of food. In the pristine world of calculus and physics, Emma found the order and predictability that eluded every other aspect of her existence. The morning that would change everything started like any other Tuesday in late October. Emma's alarm buzzed. At 5:30, a sound she'd programmed to gradually increase in volume rather than jolt her awake. She had read that sudden wake-ups could negatively impact cognitive function, and every fraction of mental capacity mattered when you were carrying a course load that would make most students weep. Advanced placement calculus, a P physics, a P chemistry, honors English literature, and a P world history filled her schedule, leaving barely enough time for the tutoring sessions that kept her family afloat financially. Her bedroom was a testament to organized efficiency. Textbooks stood in perfect rows on shelves her uncle had built from scrap wood, their spines labeled with color-coded tape that corresponded to her study schedule. A corkboard dominated one wall, covered with academic calendars, scholarship deadlines, and mathematical proof she'd copied by hand because printer ink was a luxury they couldn't afford. The centerpiece of her desk was her calculator, a Texas Instruments TI-84 plus CE that represented months of careful saving and planning. Emma's mother, Rosa, was already gone by the time she emerged from her room. The early shift at the medical center started at 6, which meant Rosa left the apartment at 5:15 to catch 2 buses across town. She cleaned patient rooms and medical equipment, work that was physically demanding and emotionally draining, but it provided health insurance and steady income. A note waited on the kitchen counter, written in Rosa's careful handwriting. "Mia, there's leftover rice in the fridge. Don't forget your sweater, te amo." The $5 bill tucked under the note was meant for lunch, but Emma already knew it would go into her college fund instead. The walk to Riverside High took 35 minutes through neighborhoods that grew progressively more affluent as she moved away from the cluster of low-income apartments where she lived. Emma used the time to review flashcards, her backpack bouncing against her hip with each step. She had memorized the optimal route that avoided the worst of the traffic and the groups of students who might notice her passing. Invisibility required strategy, and Emma had refined her techniques over 3 years of careful observation. Riverside High School stood like a monument to educational excellence, its red brick facade and manicured grounds reflecting the property taxes of the surrounding community. The building had been renovated twice in the past decade, equipped with smart boards, science labs that rivaled some colleges, and a library that Emma considered a sanctuary. The contrast between her morning journey and her destination was not lost on her. She was a scholarship student in all but name, admitted based on test scores that placed her in the 99th percentile nationally, attending a school where Most of her classmates' parents were doctors, lawyers, or business executives. The main entrance buzzed with its usual morning energy as students arrived in cars that cost more than Emma's family made in a year. She navigated through clusters of conversation, her worn canvas backpack a stark contrast to the designer bags that surrounded her. Emma had learned to time her arrival precisely, early enough to avoid the hallway congestion, but not so early that she appeared desperate or friendless. The balance was delicate, requiring the same precision she applied to solving differential equations. Her first class was a P-calculus with Mrs. Peterson, a teacher Emma respected for her no-nonsense approach to mathematics and her complete indifference to student social hierarchies. The classroom was Emma's favorite space in the entire school. With its whiteboards covered in elegant proofs and its atmosphere of intellectual seriousness, she always sat in the third row, center seat, close enough to demonstrate engagement, but not so close as to appear overeager. The students around her barely acknowledged her presence, which was exactly how she preferred it. Emma had just settled into her seat and was arranging her materials when Derek Shun slid into the desk behind her with his characteristic lack of consideration for anyone else's space. Derek was everything Emma was not: wealthy, popular, athletically gifted, and completely secure in his position at the top of Riverside High's social hierarchy. As the star of the varsity basketball team and the son of a prominent tech entrepreneur, Derek moved through the world with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Behind Derek came his constant companions, Jake Morrison and Alex Kim. Jake was the classic sidekick, always ready with a laugh at Derek's jokes and eager to participate in whatever scheme Derek devised. His father owned 3 car dealerships, and Jake had inherited both his father's aggressive sales personality and his complete lack of empathy for anyone he considered beneath him. Alex was more subtle in his cruelty, preferring psychological manipulation to Derek's more direct approach. The son of 2 surgeons, Alex had learned early that intelligence could be wielded as a weapon, and he took particular pleasure in identifying other students' vulnerabilities and exploiting them. The 3 had formed their alliance in middle school and had spent the subsequent years establishing themselves as the unofficial rulers of their grade level. They were careful never to cross lines that would bring serious administrative attention, but they had perfected the art of making life miserable for anyone who didn't fit their definition of acceptable. Emma had managed to avoid their notice for most of her high school career by maintaining her strategy of academic excellence combined with social invisibility. Mrs. Peterson began class with a review of limits and continuity, concepts that Emma found beautifully logical in their precision. She took notes in her careful handwriting, occasionally raising her hand to answer questions when the silence stretched too long, and Mrs. Peterson's expression indicated that student participation was expected. Emma's answers were always correct, delivered in a quiet voice that carried just enough confidence to demonstrate competence without appearing to show off. It was during the discussion of asymptotic behavior that Emma's careful balance began to crumble. Mrs. Peterson had posed a particularly challenging problem involving vertical asymptotes, and the class sat in uncomfortable silence as students struggled with the concept. Emma waited for someone else to respond, but when 30 seconds passed without any volunteers, she reluctantly raised her hand. "Yes, Emma?" Mrs. Peterson called on her with visible relief. Emma stood slightly, as was her habit when answering complex questions. The function approaches negative infinity as x approaches 3 from the left, and positive infinity as x approaches 3 from the right, creating a vertical asymptote at x equals 3. The discontinuity is essential because the limit doesn't exist in either direction. Mrs. Peterson beamed. "Excellent analysis. That's exactly right. Can you explain why this type of discontinuity is called essential?" Emma felt heat rising in her cheeks as every student in the room turned to look at her. This was more attention than she typically received in an entire week, and she could sense Derek and his friends focusing on her with new interest. An essential discontinuity occurs when the function oscillates without approaching any finite limit, or when it approaches infinity in at least one direction. Unlike removable discontinuities, there's no way to redefine the function at that point to make it continuous. The explanation was thorough and accurate, delivered with a quiet confidence that came from genuine understanding. Mrs. Peterson nodded approvingly and moved on to the next topic, but Emma could feel Derek's eyes on the back of her neck for the remainder of the class period. She had made a mistake, she realized with growing dread. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had allowed herself to stand out, to demonstrate the depth of her knowledge in a way that made her visible to exactly the wrong people. When the bell rang, Emma packed her materials with deliberate slowness, hoping Derek and his friends would leave first. But they lingered near their desks, and as she stood to go, Derek's voice cut through the ambient noise of students preparing for their next class. "Hey, calculator girl," he said, using a tone that was just friendly enough to maintain plausible deniability while carrying an undertone of mockery. "Nice work with the asymptotes. You some kind of math genius or something?" Emma turned slowly, her heart rate increasing as she met Derek's gaze. He was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of easy good looks that came from excellent genetics and expensive dental work. His smile was perfectly calibrated to appear charming to any adults who might be watching while conveying something entirely different to his target. "I just study hard," Emma replied quietly, hoping to deflect attention and escape the conversation. Jake laughed, a sound that contained no humor. "Study hard? Dude, she practically solved that thing in her head. That's not normal studying, that's like savant-level stuff." Alex stepped closer, his expression thoughtful in a way that Emma found more unsettling than Derek's obvious aggression. "You know what's interesting? I've been in classes with you for 3 years, and I don't think I've ever heard you speak unless a teacher called on you. But you always know the answers. Always. That's unusual." Emma felt trapped between their desks and the whiteboard, acutely aware that most of the other students had already left for their next classes. Mrs. Peterson was erasing equations from the board with her back to the room, either unaware of or choosing to ignore the interaction taking place behind her. "I should get to my next class," Emma said, attempting to step around Derek. He shifted slightly, not quite blocking her path, but making it clear that she would have to ask permission to leave. "What's the rush? We're just being friendly." "You?" "No, Jake here has been struggling with calculus. Maybe you could tutor him sometime." The suggestion was delivered with mock sincerity, but Emma recognized the trap immediately. Jake Morrison struggling with anything academic was laughable. His parents hired private tutors for every subject, and he had access to resources that Emma could only dream of. This was about something else entirely. "I'm sure Jake has access to excellent tutoring already," Emma replied carefully. "Maybe," Derek conceded, "but there's something to be said for learning from the best. And you're obviously the best, right? Top of the class, perfect test scores, all that good stuff." Emma's silence seemed to amuse him. "You know what I find interesting? You clearly have this incredible brain, but you dress like you shop at Goodwill and you eat lunch by yourself every day. It's like you're trying to hide how smart you are. Why is that?" The question hit closer to home than Emma was prepared for. She had indeed been hiding, carefully crafting an image of studious mediocrity to avoid exactly this kind of attention. But Derek's observation suggested that her camouflage was less effective than she'd believed. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, finally managing to step around Derek and move toward the door. "I just focus on my studies." "Right, your studies," Alex said, his voice following her as she reached the hallway. Must be nice to have such clear priorities. Some of us have to balance academics with, having a life. Emma escaped into the hallway with her heart pounding, but she could hear their laughter behind her. The interaction had lasted less than 5 minutes, but she knew instinctively that something fundamental had changed. She had been noticed, categorized, and marked for future attention by exactly the group of students she had spent 3 years avoiding. Her next class was a P Physics with Mr. Williams, another subject where Emma's natural aptitude was difficult to conceal. She sat in her usual seat and tried to focus on the lesson about electromagnetic fields, but her mind kept returning to Derek's questions and the calculating look in Alex's eyes. She had worked so hard to maintain her invisibility, and now she wondered if it had ever been real, or if she had simply been fortunate enough to avoid their attention until now. The physics lesson involved complex calculations about magnetic field strength, and when Mr. Williams asked for volunteers to solve problems on the board, Emma kept her hand firmly in her lap. Several other students attempted the problems with varying degrees of success, and she watched from her seat as they struggled with concepts that seemed intuitive to her. The urge to help, to share her understanding, was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to remain silent. After physics came a P chemistry, where Emma faced the same dilemma. Dr. Martinez had prepared a particularly challenging problem involving reaction stoichiometry, and when the class struggled to identify the limiting reagent, Emma felt her hand beginning to rise involuntarily. She caught herself and forced it back down, watching as confusion spread across her classmates' faces. The silence stretched uncomfortably, until Dr. Martinez finally provided hints that guided the class toward the solution. Lunch period arrived with its familiar sense of relief and dread. Emma retrieved her bag lunch from her locker and made her way to the library, her usual refuge during the social minefield of the cafeteria. The library was quiet and supervised, making it safe territory where even Derek and his friends were unlikely to cause trouble. She found her regular table in the back corner, surrounded by reference books that no one else ever accessed, and opened her a P-World history textbook to review for the afternoon's test. The library's atmosphere was exactly what Emma needed to calm her nerves. The soft rustle of turning pages, the distant hum of the ventilation system, and the occasional whispered conversation created a cocoon of academic tranquility. She ate her peanut butter sandwich slowly while reviewing her notes on the Industrial Revolution, grateful for the familiar routine that helped her anxiety subside. Mrs. Chun, the librarian, stopped by her table around 20 minutes into the lunch period. "How are you doing today, Emma? You seem a little tense." Emma looked up, surprised by the observation. Mrs. Chun was one of the few adults at Riverside High who seemed to genuinely notice individual students, probably because she spent her days observing rather than lecturing. "I'm fine, just reviewing." "For a test? World history with Mr. Roberts?" Mrs. Chun asked, glancing at the textbook. "He's tough but fair. I'm sure you'll do well." The simple expression of confidence meant more to Emma than Mrs. Chun could have known. In a school where most teachers viewed her as a quiet, competent student who required minimal attention, Mrs. Chun's genuine interest felt like a lifeline. "Thank you," Emma said, managing a small smile. "I hope so." Mrs. Chun moved on to help other students, but her brief interaction reminded Emma of why she worked so hard to excel academically. In the world of grades and test scores, her worth was measurable and undeniable. Unlike social hierarchies based on wealth or popularity, academic achievement was something she could control through effort and dedication. The afternoon's world history test went exactly as Emma had expected. Mr. Roberts had prepared a challenging examination that required not just memorization of facts but genuine understanding of historical patterns and their contemporary relevance. Emma worked through the questions methodically, her pencil moving steadily across the answer sheet as she connected concepts and analyzed primary sources. She finished with 15 minutes to spare, which she used to review her responses and ensure her handwriting was legible. As students began submitting their tests, Emma noticed Derek turning in his exam with the casual confidence of someone who had either prepared thoroughly or simply didn't care about the outcome. Their eyes met briefly as he passed her desk, and his slight smile suggested that their morning encounter was still very much on his mind. Emma's final class of the day was Honors English Literature with Miss Foster, a teacher known for her passionate discussions of classical works and her insistence that literature could illuminate universal human truths. They were currently reading The Great Gatsby, and Emma found herself deeply engaged with the themes of social class and the American dream, concepts that resonated with her own experiences in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Miss Foster had prepared a discussion about symbolism in Fitzgerald's work, and as the conversation developed, Emma found herself torn between her desire to contribute and her newfound awareness of the risks of standing out. When Miss Foster asked about the significance of the green light across the bay, Emma knew the answer intimately. She understood Gatsby's yearning for something just out of reach, his belief that the right achievements could transform his fundamental identity, his faith that excellence could overcome the circumstances of his birth. "Emma," Miss Foster called on her directly. "You look like you have thoughts about this." Emma realized she had been staring out the window, lost in contemplation. The entire class was looking at her expectantly, including Derek, who sat 3 rows away with an expression of amused interest. "The green light represents the illusion of accessibility," Emma said carefully. "Gatsby can see it every night, which makes his dream feel achievable, but he can never actually reach it. The distance is both physical and metaphorical." Miss Foster nodded encouragingly. "Elaborate on the metaphorical distance." Emma glanced around the room, acutely aware that she was once again demonstrating the kind of analytical thinking that set her apart from her peers. Gatsby believes that wealth and status can transform him into someone worthy of Daisy, but he doesn't understand that the truly wealthy never had to transform themselves. They were born into belonging. His efforts to join their world only highlight how much he doesn't belong. The analysis was more personal than Emma had intended, and she felt exposed as Miss Foster's expression grew thoughtful. "That's a sophisticated reading. Do you think Fitzgerald is suggesting that social mobility is impossible?" Before Emma could respond, Derek's voice cut through the discussion. "Maybe Gatsby just needed to try harder. Work smarter, not harder, you know? If you're good enough at something, people have to respect you eventually." The comment was clearly directed at Emma, though phrased as a contribution to the literary discussion. Miss Foster looked pleased by the engagement, unaware of the underlying dynamics at play. "That's an interesting perspective, Derek," she said. "But consider whether Fitzgerald might be critiquing exactly that kind of meritocratic thinking. Emma, what do you think?" Emma felt trapped between her desire to engage with the literature she loved and her growing awareness that every word she spoke was being evaluated by Derek for some purpose she couldn't yet understand. "I think Fitzgerald is showing us that merit isn't always enough. Sometimes the system itself prevents certain people from succeeding, no matter how qualified they are." The discussion continued for the remainder of the class period, with other students offering their interpretations of the novel's themes. Emma participated minimally, but she could feel Derek's attention like a weight on her shoulders. When the final bell rang, she packed her materials quickly and headed for her locker, hoping to collect her things and escape before encountering him again. Her locker was located in the main hallway, unfortunately positioned near the entrance to the gymnasium where Derek and his teammates gathered before basketball practice. Emma had timed her post-school routine carefully over the years to avoid this particular bottleneck, but her desire to escape quickly had disrupted her usual schedule. As she approached her locker, she could see Derek, Jake, and Alex already assembled near the gym doors. their voices carrying across the hallway as they discussed something that involved frequent glances in her direction. Emma focused on her combination lock, trying to appear absorbed in the simple task of opening her locker, while actually listening for any indication of their intentions. Her lock was old and temperamental, requiring a precise touch that she had mastered through daily practice. Left to 14, right to 27, left to 8. The mechanism clicked open, and she began transferring books from her locker to her backpack, organizing tomorrow's materials with the efficiency born of long habit. "Hey, calculator girl." Derek's voice came from directly behind her, much closer than she had expected. Emma turned to find all three boys standing within arm's reach of her locker, their positioning clearly deliberate. Derek leaned against the adjacent locker with studied casualness, while Jake and Alex flanked him in a formation that blocked her escape route without appearing overtly threatening. "I was thinking about our conversation this morning," Derek continued, his tone conversational. "And I realized I never got your name. I mean, your real name. Calculator girl works, but it seems a little impersonal." "Emma Rodriguez," she replied quietly, turning back to her locker in hopes of signaling that she wanted the conversation to end. "Emma Rodriguez," Derek repeated, as if testing how the name sounded. "That's a nice name. Very multicultural. Your family from around here originally?" The question carried implications that Emma recognized immediately. Riverside was a predominantly white, affluent community, and her surname marked her as an outsider in ways that went beyond economics. "We moved here when I was in middle school." "From where?" Alex asked, his voice carrying the kind of casual curiosity that wasn't casual at all. Emma hesitated, knowing that her answer would provide more ammunition for whatever game they were playing. "East Valley." Jake whistled low. "East Valley? That's quite a commute. Must be important for you to come all the way out here for school." Emma understood the subtext perfectly. East Valley was known for its struggling schools and high poverty rates, and Jake's comment was designed to highlight the contrast between her background and their own. "The education here is excellent," she said simply. "It really is," Derek agreed with mock sincerity. "We're lucky to have such great resources. Advanced classes, state-of-the-art labs, excellent teachers. Of course, all that quality comes at a price. Property taxes in this district are pretty brutal. My dad complains about them constantly." The implication was clear. Families like Emma's didn't contribute to the tax base that funded the school's excellence, making her presence something between charity and theft. Emma felt her jaw tighten, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn here." "I'm sure you are," Alex said smoothly. "And you're certainly making the most of it. Top grades in every class from what I hear. That's really impressive dedication." Emma finished organizing her backpack and closed her locker, but Derek made no move to step aside. "It's actually kind of inspiring," he continued. "Seeing someone work so hard to overcome their circumstances really makes you think about the value of opportunity." The patronizing tone was carefully calculated to sound supportive to any adults who might overhear, while delivering its intended message to Emma herself. She was being categorized as a charity case, a deserving poor student whose presence served to make her wealthy classmates feel generous and enlightened. "I should get going," Emma said, attempting to step around Derek. "I have tutoring to do." "Tutoring?" Jake's interest seemed genuine. "You tutor other students? That's gotta pay pretty well." Emma realized she had revealed more than she intended. "Just some younger kids who need help with math." "That's really entrepreneurial of you," Derek said, finally stepping aside, but continuing to talk as Emma began walking toward the main exit. "I respect the hustle. Shows real character when someone's willing to work for what they want, instead of just expecting handouts." The comment stung because it contained just enough truth to be difficult to dismiss entirely. Emma did work constantly, both academically and financially, to maintain her position at Riverside High, but Derek's phrasing made her efforts sound desperate and grasping rather than admirable. As Emma reached the main doors, she heard Derek call after her one final time. "See you tomorrow, Emma. Looking forward to getting to know you better." The promise felt more like a threat, and Emma walked quickly toward the bus stop, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. For 3 years, she had successfully navigated the social complexities of Riverside High through careful observation and strategic invisibility. Now, in the span of a single day, all of that careful work had been undone by a few moments of academic excellence that had caught Derek's attention. The bus ride home took 45 minutes through increasingly familiar neighborhoods, giving Emma time to analyze her situation with the same methodical approach she applied to complex mathematical problems. Derek's interest in her was clearly not positive, but she couldn't yet determine the exact nature of the threat he represented. His questions had been probing and personal, designed to gather information rather than simply harass her. Alex's participation suggested a level of planning that went beyond casual bullying, while Jake's enthusiasm indicated that whatever they were planning would likely involve humiliation as entertainment. Emma's apartment building came into view as the bus rounded the final corner, its worn brick facade and small parking lot a stark contrast to the manicured neighborhood surrounding Riverside High. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3B, keys ready before she reached the door. The familiar sounds of her neighbors' lives filtered through thin walls. Televisions playing in Spanish, children laughing, someone cooking with spices that made the hallway smell like home. Inside the apartment, Emma found another note from her mother explaining that she would be working a double shift and wouldn't be home until after midnight. The silence was both comforting and lonely, giving Emma space to think while reminding her of how much of her mother's life was consumed by work. She heated leftover rice in the microwave and ate standing at the kitchen counter while reviewing her calculus homework, the familiar routine helping to calm her nerves. Her evening tutoring session was with Miguel Santos, a freshman who struggled with algebra but showed genuine enthusiasm for learning when concepts were explained in ways that connected to his interests. Emma had discovered that Miguel understood mathematical relationships better when she framed them in terms of basketball statistics, and their sessions had become one of the highlights of her week. Miguel's family paid her $15 per hour, money that went directly into her college savings account. As she walked to Miguel's house, Emma found herself looking over her shoulder more frequently than usual. Derek's promise to get to know her better echoed in her mind, carrying implications that she couldn't ignore. She had worked too hard and come too far to let 3 privileged bullies derail her academic career, but she also understood that her options for dealing with them were limited. Fighting back directly would likely result in consequences that she couldn't afford, while complaining to administrators might only escalate their attention. Miguel's tutoring session went well, with Emma helping him understand the concept of slope through basketball shooting angles and defensive positioning. His genuine excitement when concepts finally clicked reminded her why she loved teaching and reinforced her determination not to let Derek and his friends interfere with her goals. As she walked home through the gathering darkness, Emma made a decision that would prove more prescient than she realized at the time. Tomorrow she would be more careful. She would participate less in class discussions, keep her head down even more than usual, and hope that Derek's interest in her was superficial enough to fade if she stopped providing entertainment. Emma Rodriguez had no way of knowing that Derek Chun had already made his own decision about her future at Riverside High, and that being careful would not be nearly enough to protect her from what was coming. Emma's strategy of heightened invisibility lasted exactly 3 days before it became clear that Derek Chun had no intention of losing interest in his new target. If anything, her attempts to avoid attention seemed to amuse him, transforming what might have been casual harassment into a deliberate campaign of psychological warfare that demonstrated both his patience and his understanding of how to exploit weakness without crossing lines that would bring administrative intervention. Wednesday morning began with Emma discovering that someone had taped a printed Wikipedia article calculator history to her locker, complete with highlighted sections about the evolution from mechanical to electronic computation. The article itself was educational and harmless, but the implication was unmistakable. She had been categorized, labeled, and marked for ongoing attention. Emma removed the paper quickly, but not before several students noticed it, and she caught whispered conversations that died abruptly when she approached. In calculus class, Derek made a point of asking Mrs. Peterson if they could use calculators for their upcoming test, a question that prompted several students to look meaningfully at Emma. The teacher's response that calculators were indeed permitted led Derek to wonder aloud whether everyone in the class had access to the same quality of technology. Since some mathematical tools were quite expensive and might give certain students unfair advantages, Mrs. Peterson dismissed the concern with a brief comment about the school's policy of providing necessary materials to students who needed them. But Emma felt every eye in the room evaluating her reaction to the exchange. The psychological pressure was expertly applied, designed to make Emma hyper-aware of her visibility, while providing Derek with plausible deniability about his intentions. When she raised her hand to answer a question about derivatives, Derek would cough softly just as she began speaking, forcing her to pause and restart her response. When she worked problems on the board, he would whisper to Jake about the elegance of her handwriting, comments that sounded complimentary but carried an undertone of mockery that only Emma could fully appreciate. By Thursday, the harassment had evolved into a more sophisticated form of social engineering. Derek began approaching Emma's tutoring students before their sessions, striking up friendly conversations about their academic progress and casually mentioning that he'd heard Emma was an excellent teacher. The conversations were perfectly innocent on the surface, but they served the dual purpose of gathering information about Emma's schedule and activities while subtly positioning Derek as someone with insider knowledge about her life. Miguel Santos mentioned during their Thursday session that a tall guy from the basketball team had asked him about his math grades and seemed really interested in hearing about his tutoring experience. The description clearly matched Derek, and Emma realized with growing dread that her harassment was expanding beyond school hours and school property. Derek was mapping her life, identifying her routines and vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of someone planning a complex operation. The weekend provided a brief respite, but Emma spent Saturday and Sunday anticipating Monday with increasing anxiety. She tried to focus on her part-time job at the local library, where she reshelved books and helped patrons with research requests, but her concentration was fractured by constant worry about what Derek might be planning. Her mother noticed her distraction during their Sunday dinner, one of the few meals they shared together each week. "Mia, you seem worried about something," Rosa said, studying Emma's face with the perceptiveness that came from years of single parenthood. "Is everything okay at school?" Emma considered telling her mother about Derek's harassment, but the conversation would inevitably lead to discussions about transferring schools or involving administrators, options that could jeopardize her academic standing and college prospects. "Just stressed about upcoming tests," she said instead, a half-truth that satisfied Rosa's immediate concern while avoiding the larger issue. Monday arrived with unseasonably warm weather that had students shedding jackets and opening windows. Throughout Riverside High, Emma wore her most inconspicuous outfit, a plain navy sweater and dark jeans that she hoped would help her blend into the background. But she could feel Derek's attention the moment she entered the building. He was standing near the main entrance with his usual entourage, and their conversation stopped when she passed, resuming in lower tones that suggested she had become a topic of ongoing discussion. The morning's classes proceeded without major incident, though Emma noticed that Derek seemed to be tracking her movements with unusual precision. During the transition between second and third periods, she spotted him in hallways where he had no classes, always positioned where he could observe her without appearing to follow her directly. The surveillance was subtle but unmistakable, creating a constant sense of being watched that made concentration nearly impossible. Lunch period brought a false sense of security as Emma settled into her usual corner of the library with a sandwich and her chemistry textbook. She had been reviewing molecular orbital theory for 20 minutes when Mrs. Chun approached her table with an expression of mild concern. "Emma, there are some students here who say they need to discuss a group project with you," the librarian sighed, gesturing toward the main desk where Derek, Jake, and Alex stood waiting with expressions of polite expectation. Emma's heart rate spiked as she realized the trap she had walked into. Derek had used his natural charisma and social standing to convince Mrs. Chun that they had legitimate academic business with Emma, positioning himself as a concerned classmate, rather than a predator stalking his prey. Refusing to speak with them would require explaining the harassment to Mrs. Chun, potentially creating a scene that would bring exactly the kind of attention Emma had been trying to avoid. "Of course," Emma said quietly, closing her textbook and following Mrs. Chun to the front of the library where Derek waited with his perfectly calibrated smile. "Thanks so much for arranging this, Mrs. Chun," Derek said with the easy charm that made adults automatically trust him. "We really appreciate having a quiet place to discuss our project." Mrs. Chun beamed at the polite young man and returned to her duties, leaving Emma alone with 3 students who had spent the better part of a week planning this moment. Derek gestured toward a table in the reference section, far enough from Mrs. Chun's desk to allow private conversation but close enough to maintain the illusion of legitimate academic activity. "Please sit," Derek said, pulling out a chair for Emma with exaggerated courtesy. "We have so much to discuss." Emma remained standing, her backpack clutched against her chest like a shield. "What do you want?" "Want?" Derek laughed softly, settling into his own chair with casual grace. "We don't want anything. We're here to offer you something. An opportunity, you might say." Jake leaned forward eagerly, apparently unable to contain his excitement about whatever plan they had devised. "Yeah, we've been thinking about what you said the other day, about tutoring and helping other students. That's really admirable." "Very entrepreneurial," Alex added, his tone carrying the same calculated sincerity that Emma had learned to distrust. "It got us thinking about ways we could help you expand your business." Emma felt a chill despite the library's warm atmosphere. "I don't understand." Derek steepled his fingers, a gesture that made him look older and more sophisticated than his 17 years. "Well, here's the thing. You're clearly brilliant at mathematics, probably the smartest person in our entire grade level. But you're also obviously struggling financially, which limits your opportunities to really shine." The observation was delivered with mock sympathy, but Emma could hear the cruel satisfaction beneath Derek's concerned tone. He was enjoying her discomfort, feeding off her obvious anxiety about where this conversation was heading. "We think that's unfair," Jake chimed in. "Someone with your talent shouldn't be held back by circumstances beyond your control." Alex nodded gravely. "It's a classic case of systemic inequality. Brilliant minds being wasted because of economic barriers." Emma realized that they were building towards something, creating a narrative that would justify whatever scheme they had developed. The pseudo-intellectual language was designed to make their harassment sound like social activism, a particularly twisted form of manipulation that demonstrated Alex's sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. "So we've come up with a solution," Derek announced, reaching into his backpack to retrieve a manila folder. "A way for you to earn some serious money while showcasing your academic abilities." He opened the folder to reveal what appeared to be a contract, complete with official-looking headers and multiple pages of dense text. Emma caught glimpses of terms like academic consulting services, and performance-based compensation before Derek closed the folder again. "What is that?" Emma asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. "It's a business proposal," Derek explained patiently. "See, there are a lot of students at Riverside High who struggle with advanced mathematics and science. Students whose parents would pay very well for guaranteed academic improvement." Jake's grin widened. "And who better to provide that improvement than the smartest girl in school?" Emma began to understand the true nature of their proposal, and the realization filled her with cold dread. "You want me to cheat for other students?" "Cheat is such an ugly word," Alex said with mock disappointment. "We prefer to think of it as academic collaboration. You would provide consultation services for students who need help achieving their full potential." Derek leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. "Look, Emma, let's be realistic about your situation. You're incredibly smart, but intelligence alone isn't going to pay for college. Even with perfect grades, you're looking at massive student loan debt that will take decades to repay. This opportunity could change all of that." The offer was clearly designed to exploit Emma's financial insecurity while appealing to her desire for academic success. They had identified her most vulnerable points and crafted a proposal that addressed her real needs while requiring her to compromise everything she believed in. "I'm not interested," Emma said firmly, taking a step back from the table. Derek's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "That's disappointing, but not entirely unexpected. People in your position often have difficulty seeing the bigger picture." "What's that supposed to mean?" Jake leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, you've got this whole moral superiority thing going on. It's kind of endearing, actually. The poor girl who succeeds through pure virtue and hard work." Alex picked up the thread smoothly. "But virtue doesn't pay tuition, does it? And hard work only gets you so far when you're competing against people who have every advantage." Derek stood slowly, his height suddenly seeming more intimidating in the confined space between library shelves. "Here's what I think, Emma. I think you're scared. Scared that if you step outside your comfort zone, you might discover that you're not as special as you think you are." Emma felt her jaw clench, recognizing the manipulation for what it was. "I'm not scared. I'm principled." "Principles?" Derek repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "You know what principles are? They're luxuries that only wealthy people can afford. When you're poor, you take opportunities where you find them." The comment was designed to sting, and it succeeded. Emma understood that Derek was trying to provoke her into an emotional response that would give him more leverage, but knowing his strategy didn't make the words less painful. "I said I'm not interested," Emma repeated, turning to leave. "Emma, wait." Derek's voice stopped her just as she reached the end of the reference aisle. "I really hope you'll reconsider. This could be the beginning of a beautiful friendship." The way he emphasized the word hope made it sound less like optimism and more like a warning. Emma hurried back to her corner table and gathered her materials, acutely aware that Derek and his friends remained in the reference section, their voices carrying in low murmurs that occasionally erupted into quiet laughter. The afternoons. Classes passed in a blur of anxiety as Emma tried to focus on her coursework while processing what had just happened. Derek's offer had been more sophisticated than simple bullying, representing a calculated attempt to corrupt her academically, while positioning himself as her benefactor. The psychological manipulation was expert, designed to make her question her own motivations while presenting moral compromise as practical necessity. When the final bell rang, Emma moved quickly toward her locker, hoping to collect her things and escape before encountering Derek again. But as she rounded the corner into the main hallway, she discovered that her locker had acquired new decoration overnight. Someone had taped a printout of scholarship applications to the metal surface, along with a note that read, "Thought you might need these," in cheerful blue ink. Emma ripped the papers down quickly, but not before several students noticed them. The scholarship applications were legitimate, covering everything from need-based financial aid to merit scholarships for outstanding academic achievement. On the surface, the gesture appeared helpful, even kind. But Emma understood the true message. Her financial situation was being broadcast to the entire school, marking her as someone who needed charity and assistance. As she fumbled with her combination lock, Emma became aware of Derek approaching with his characteristic confidence. He moved through the crowded hallway like he owned it, other students automatically stepping aside to clear his path. When he reached her locker, he leaned against the adjacent door with studied casualness. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, nodding toward the scholarship papers Emma had crumpled in her fist. "You did this," Emma said quietly, not trusting herself to speak louder without her voice breaking. Derek's expression was the picture of innocent confusion. "Did what?" "I have no idea what you're talking about." Jake and Alex materialized on either side of him, creating their familiar formation that blocked escape routes while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Emma noticed that several other students had slowed their passage through the hallway, sensing drama in the air and positioning themselves to observe whatever was about to unfold. "Someone put scholarship information on my locker," Emma explained, though she knew Derek understood perfectly well what she was referring to. "Really?" Jake's surprise sounded genuine to anyone who didn't know him well. "That's actually pretty thoughtful. College costs are crazy these days." Alex nodded sagely. "Financial aid is so important for students who need assistance. There's no shame in seeking help when you're facing economic hardship." Emma realized that they were deliberately having this conversation in front of an audience, ensuring that her financial situation became public knowledge, while positioning themselves as sympathetic observers rather than orchestrators of her humiliation. The strategy was sophisticated and cruel, designed to isolate her socially while maintaining their own reputations as helpful classmates. "I don't need financial aid," Emma said, immediately regretting the defensive tone that made her sound exactly as insecure as she felt. Derek raised an eyebrow. "No, that's interesting. Most students from East Valley need some kind of assistance to attend school here. The commute alone must be expensive." Emma felt heat rising in her cheeks as she realized how thoroughly Derek had researched her background. He knew about her neighborhood, her family's economic situation, probably even her mother's work schedule. The knowledge gave him tremendous power over her, allowing him to expose her vulnerabilities at will. "There's nothing wrong with needing help," Alex said with false kindness. "In fact, it shows strength to acknowledge when you're facing challenges beyond your control." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, like that tutoring business you run. That's really inspiring, seeing someone work so hard to overcome their circumstances." Emma began stuffing books into her backpack with quick, angry movements, desperate to escape this public dissection of her personal life. But Derek wasn't finished with her yet. "You know what's really admirable?" Derek continued, his voice carrying clearly to the growing audience of students. "The way you maintain such high academic standards despite all the pressure you must be under at home." The comment was perfectly crafted to sound supportive while actually highlighting Emma's economic disadvantage and implying that her home environment was somehow deficient. Emma felt tears of frustration, threatening and fought to maintain her composure. "I should get going," Emma said, shouldering her backpack and attempting to move past Derek. He stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, but his voice followed her as she began walking toward the exit. "Of course. I'm sure you have tutoring appointments to keep. That's really entrepreneurial of you." Emma heard laughter from some of the observing students, though she couldn't tell whether they were laughing at Derek's comments or at her obvious discomfort. Either way, the sound felt like a physical blow, confirming that she had become a source of entertainment for her classmates. The bus ride home was torture, with Emma replaying every moment of the day's humiliation while trying to understand Derek's long-term strategy. His harassment was too calculated to be simple bullying, too sophisticated to be random cruelty. He was building toward something, gathering information and applying pressure for reasons that extended beyond mere entertainment. That evening, Emma tried to focus on her homework, but concentration proved impossible. She found herself staring at calculus problems without seeing them, her mind consumed by anxiety about what Derek might do next. When her phone rang with a call from an unknown number, she almost didn't answer, but concern that it might be one of her tutoring students' parents convinced her to pick up. "Emma Rodriguez?" The voice was unfamiliar, formal, slightly accented. "Yes, this is Emma. My name is Dr. Patel. My son Arjun is in your chemistry class. I understand you provide tutoring services?" Emma felt a flicker of relief. A legitimate tutoring inquiry would provide both income and a distraction from her problems with Derek. "Yes, I do tutor chemistry and mathematics. What kind of help is Arjun looking for?" Dr. Patel explained that his son was struggling with advanced chemistry concepts despite having excelled in previous science courses. The family was willing to pay $25 per hour for twice-weekly sessions, significantly more than Emma's usual rate. The opportunity seemed too good to be true, which should have made her suspicious, but her financial desperation overrode her caution. They arranged for Emma to meet Arjun at the public library the following afternoon for an initial assessment session. Dr. Patel provided his son's phone number and expressed gratitude for Emma's willingness to help on such short notice. The conversation was professional and encouraging, exactly what Emma needed after her terrible day. Tuesday morning brought no respite from Derek's psychological campaign. Emma discovered that someone had submitted her name to the school counselor as a student who might benefit from the free breakfast program, leading to an awkward conversation with Mrs. Williams about nutritional assistance and academic performance. The counselor's genuine concern made the situation even more humiliating, as Emma was forced to explain that she didn't need free breakfast while wondering how her financial situation had become a topic of administrative discussion. In chemistry class, Dr. Martinez announced that students would be working in pairs for the upcoming laboratory unit on chemical equilibrium. Emma typically preferred working alone, but the pairing system was mandatory and alphabetical, which should have meant she would work with David Richardson, a quiet student who shared her preference for academic focus. Instead, Dr. Martinez announced that David had requested a different partner for medical reasons, leaving Emma to work with whoever remained unpaired after the initial assignments. Emma watched with growing dread as students found their partners, leaving her standing alone at the front of the classroom until Dr. Martinez consulted his roster with a frown. "It looks like we have an odd number of students today. Emma, you'll need to join one of the existing pairs to form a group of 3. Derek's hand shot up immediately. "Dr. Martinez, Emma can work with Jake and me. We'd be happy to help her out." The offer sounded generous and inclusive, exactly the kind of cross-social group collaboration that teachers love to encourage. Dr. Martinez beamed his approval while Emma felt her stomach drop. She had no legitimate reason to refuse the invitation. Without explaining Derek's harassment campaign, which would create exactly the kind of scene she had been trying to avoid. "That's very thoughtful, Derek," Dr. Martinez said. "Emma, please join Derek and Jake at Station 4. Emma gathered her materials and moved reluctantly to the designated laboratory station, where Derek and Jake waited with expressions of barely contained glee. They had engineered the situation perfectly, using the teacher's own policies to force Emma into a position where she would be completely under their control for the remainder of the semester. "This is going to be great," Jake said as Emma arranged her notebook and calculator on the lab bench. "We're going to learn so much from each other." Derek nodded with mock sincerity. "Absolutely. I think this partnership is going to be very educational for everyone involved." Dr. Martinez began explaining the equilibrium experiments they would be conducting over the next 2 weeks, but Emma barely heard him. She was trapped in a laboratory group with her tormentors, forced to work closely with them while maintaining the pretense of academic collaboration. Derek had escalated his campaign in a way that was both brilliant and diabolical, using the educational system itself as a weapon against her. The first laboratory session was a masterclass in subtle psychological torture. Derek and Jake appeared to be model partners, asking Emma thoughtful questions about chemical reactions and deferring to her expertise when calculating molecular concentrations. To any observer, including Dr. Martinez, they seemed genuinely interested in learning from Emma's superior knowledge. But beneath the surface, they were systematically undermining her confidence through a series of microaggressions and calculated mistakes. Derek would accidentally knock over her carefully measured solutions, forcing her to start time-consuming preparations over again. Jake would misread important measurements just slightly, creating errors that took precious time to identify and correct. When Emma tried to explain concepts, they would ask increasingly detailed questions that forced her to spend entire class periods teaching rather than learning. "I'm still not understanding the relationship between concentration and equilibrium." "Constant," Derek said with perfectly feigned confusion as Emma attempted to complete their third experiment. "Could you explain it again? Maybe with more examples this time?" Emma looked at the clock and realized that Derek's questions had consumed 20 minutes of their 50-minute class period, leaving insufficient time to complete the required measurements. She would have to rush through the remaining procedures, potentially compromising the accuracy of their results and ultimately affecting her grade in the class. The equilibrium constant is determined by the ratio of product concentrations to reactant concentrations at equilibrium, Emma explained quickly, trying to set up the next phase of their experiment while talking. When you increase the concentration of reactants, the system shifts toward products to maintain the constant ratio. Jake frowned thoughtfully. "But what if the temperature changes? Does that affect the constant?" The question was legitimate and demonstrated genuine curiosity, but Emma realized that answering it thoroughly would consume another 10 minutes she couldn't afford to lose. She was being forced to choose between helping her lab partners learn and completing her own academic requirements, a no-win situation that Derek had orchestrated with remarkable sophistication. "Temperature does affect the equilibrium constant," Emma said tersely, focusing on her measurements. "We can discuss it after we finish the experiment." Derek exchanged a meaningful look with Jake, a silent communication that Emma caught in her peripheral vision. They were clearly pleased with her growing frustration, having successfully maneuvered her into a position where academic excellence required her to appear unhelpful and antisocial. The laboratory period ended with their experiment incomplete and Emma's stress level at dangerous heights. As students began cleaning their stations and submitting their preliminary results, Derek approached Dr. Martinez with an expression of concerned confusion. "Dr. Martinez, I'm a little worried about our group's progress," Derek said quietly, though Emma could hear every word from her position at the sink. "Emma seems really stressed about something, and I'm not sure Jake and I are getting the support we need to understand the material." Emma felt her hands begin to shake as she rinsed glassware, realizing that Derek was positioning himself as the victim of her academic arrogance. Dr. Martinez glanced in her direction with newfound concern, clearly wondering whether his star chemistry student was having difficulty working collaboratively with her peers. "I'll keep an eye on the situation," Dr. Martinez assured Derek. Sometimes high-achieving students need reminders about the importance of teamwork and patience. Emma finished cleaning her equipment in silence, understanding that Derek had successfully reframed their dynamic to make her appear as the problem. Any future complaints she might make about their behavior would be filtered through this new narrative of her being an uncooperative partner who looked down on her less gifted classmates. After chemistry class, Emma sought refuge in the library. During her free period, hoping to process what had happened and develop strategies for dealing with Derek's escalating campaign. But even her sanctuary had been compromised. Mrs. Chun approached her corner table with a slightly awkward expression. "Emma, I hate to bother you, but I've had several students ask about your tutoring services," the librarian said. "Apparently, word is getting around about how helpful you are." Emma looked up from her calculus textbook with growing suspicion. "What kind of questions?" Mrs. Chun consulted a small notepad. "Well, there's been interest in your rates, your availability, and your areas of expertise. Some students seemed particularly curious about whether you offer assistance with test preparation." The questions were clearly designed to gather intelligence about Emma's tutoring business, probably as part of Derek's ongoing research into her vulnerabilities. Emma realized that her every activity was being monitored and cataloged, creating a comprehensive profile that could be used against her in ways she hadn't yet imagined. "I appreciate people's interest," Emma said carefully, "but I prefer to handle tutoring arrangements privately." Mrs. Shun nodded understandingly. "Of course, I just thought you should know that there seems to be genuine demand for your services. You're obviously very talented at explaining complex concepts." After Mrs. Chun returned to her duties, Emma sat staring at her textbook without reading, her mind racing as she tried to understand the full scope of Derek's strategy. He wasn't just harassing her randomly. He was conducting a systematic campaign to gather information, isolate her socially, and position himself as her benefactor while simultaneously undermining her academic standing. The realization that her afternoon tutoring session with Arjun Patel might be another trap occurred to Emma, just as the final bell rang. Dr. Patel's call had come immediately after her public humiliation in the hallway, the timing too convenient to be coincidental. But canceling the session would mean losing income she desperately needed, and Emma couldn't afford to become paranoid about every opportunity that came her way. She arrived at the public library 15 minutes early, hoping to observe Arjun's arrival and assess whether the tutoring request was legitimate. The main reading room was nearly empty on a Tuesday afternoon, with only a few elderly patrons browsing magazines and a college student working on a laptop in the corner. Emma chose a table near the reference section where she could see the entrance. While appearing to study, Arjun Patel arrived precisely on time, a thin boy with nervous energy and an overstuffed backpack that suggested genuine academic commitment. He looked around the reading room uncertainly until Emma waved to get his attention. As he approached her table, Emma felt her suspicions beginning to ease. Arjun seemed authentically anxious about his chemistry struggles, not like someone participating in an elaborate deception. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice," Arjun said as he settled into the chair across from Emma. "I'm really struggling with equilibrium concepts, and my dad thought you might be able to help." Emma opened her chemistry textbook and began assessing Arjun's understanding of basic principles. His knowledge was solid but incomplete, exactly what she would expect from a student who had mastered earlier material but was struggling with more advanced applications. They worked through several practice problems together, with Arjun showing genuine improvement as Emma explained the underlying concepts. The session was proceeding normally when Emma noticed Derek Chun entering the library with Jake Morrison. They moved through the main reading room with apparent purpose, scanning the tables until Derek's gaze settled on Emma and Arjun. Derek's expression shifted to one of pleased surprise, as if their encounter was completely coincidental. "Emma, what a coincidence," Derek called out as he approached their table, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet library. "I didn't know you tutored here." Emma felt her stomach clench as she realized that Derek had somehow known about her appointment with Arjun. Either Dr. Patel's call had been a setup from the beginning, or Derek had access to information about her tutoring schedule through other means. "Hi, Derek," Emma said quietly, hoping to discourage a prolonged conversation. "Arjun and I are working on chemistry problems." Derek smiled warmly at Arjun, who looked confused by the interruption. Chemistry, huh? That's great. Emma's fantastic at chemistry. You're really lucky to have her as a tutor. Jake nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, she's like a walking textbook. Knows everything about everything. Arjun glanced between Emma and her unexpected visitors, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. Do you all go to school together? We do, Derek confirmed. Same grade, several classes together. Emma's quite famous at Riverside High for her academic achievements. The way Derek emphasized the word famous made it sound like notoriety rather than admiration. Emma realized that he was subtly undermining her reputation with a potential tutoring client, possibly as part of a larger plan to interfere with her income sources. Well, we should let you get back to your session, Derek said after an uncomfortable pause. Don't want to interrupt such important work. As Derek and Jake moved away toward the periodical section, Emma tried to refocus on helping Arjun, but the damage was already done. The interruption had broken their concentration and introduced an element of social complexity that made their tutorial relationship feel awkward and artificial. Those guys seem to know you pretty well, Arjun observed as Emma attempted to return to their equilibrium calculations. Emma nodded without elaborating, hoping to avoid discussing her relationship with Derek in detail. But Arjun's curiosity had been piqued, and he continued asking questions about her school experience and social connections. The academic session devolved into uncomfortable small talk that accomplished little learning and left Emma feeling exposed and frustrated. When their hour concluded, Arjun paid Emma the agreed-upon $25, but seemed less enthusiastic about scheduling future sessions. The encounter with Derek had clearly affected his perception of Emma, introducing doubts about her social standing and possibly her academic credibility. As Emma watched Arjun leave the library, she realized that Derek had successfully sabotaged another aspect of her life with minimal effort and maximum plausible deniability. Derek and Jake remained in the periodical section until Emma gathered her materials to leave, ensuring that their presence felt like surveillance rather than coincidence. As Emma passed their table on her way to the exit, Derek looked up from the magazine he was pretending to read. See you tomorrow, Emma, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Looking forward to our next chemistry lab. The threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable. Emma hurried out of the library with her heart pounding, understanding that Derek's campaign against her was entering a new phase. He was no longer content with school-based harassment. He was actively interfering with her income and her ability to maintain the financial independence that made her academic success possible. That night, Emma lay awake replaying every interaction she'd had with Derek since their first encounter in calculus class. His strategy was becoming clearer with each incident. Gather information about her vulnerabilities, isolate her from potential allies, and systematically undermine her sources of strength and stability. The approach was sophisticated enough to avoid triggering administrative intervention, while being devastating enough to threaten everything she had worked to achieve. Emma understood with growing certainty that Derek Chun was not going to lose interest in tormenting her. If anything, her resistance seemed to be encouraging his creativity, pushing him to develop increasingly elaborate schemes for making her life miserable. She was facing an adversary with superior resources, social connections, and institutional protection. Someone who viewed her suffering as entertainment and her dreams as obstacles to be demolished. The realization that she was completely alone in this fight should have been devastating, but instead it triggered something deeper than fear or despair. Emma Rodriguez had spent her entire life overcoming obstacles that would have crushed other people. She had survived poverty, discrimination, and countless setbacks through sheer determination and careful planning. Derek Chun might have money and influence, but he had no idea what he was really fighting against. As Wednesday morning approached, Emma made a decision that would prove more significant than she realized at the time. She was done being Derek's victim, done allowing him to dictate the terms of their conflict, done pretending that passive resistance would eventually solve her problems. Derek had made the mistake of thinking that her quiet demeanor indicated weakness when in reality it had been strategic restraint. Emma had no way of knowing that Derek had already made his own decision about escalating their conflict, or that Thursday would bring the confrontation that would change both of their lives forever. She simply knew that she was tired of being afraid, tired of being hunted, and tired of allowing someone else's cruelty to limit her potential. The honor student who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility was about to discover that sometimes the only way to become truly invisible was to first become completely unforgettable. Derek Chun had awakened something in Emma Rodriguez that he was utterly unprepared to handle, and the reckoning that was coming would leave everyone involved speechless in ways that none of them could possibly anticipate. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.